A different perspective now on the significance of the Mexico election, both for Mexico and beyond. Duncan Wood is the director of the Mexico Institute at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. He lectures and publishes widely in Mexico, the U.S., and Canada. He joins us from Mexico City. Not long ago, people were talking about what they called Mexico's moment. That doesn't seem to have happened. So in that context, what does this election represent for Mexico domestically, first of all?
So what's fascinating about Mexico's moment back in 2012, 2013, is that the country achieved so much in a really short period of time, passing these important structural reforms that were supposed to get the economy on track and really resolve many of Mexico's developmental problems. And what's happened, sadly, is that not only have those reforms really not paid off in the short term, largely because of weak implementation in many of the areas, but also things have got a lot worse in terms of inequality, in terms of crime and violence, in terms of a real failure of the justice system to make people's lives better and safer. And so Mexican people are looking at this government of Enrique Peña Nieto, and they're saying, this is a government that promised us so much, and we were willing to go along with the return of the formerly hegemonic Free Party in 2012 on the understanding that they would make things better for us. And 6 years later, things aren't better for us, and in fact, in many ways, they're worse. And of course, the single biggest issue here is really the corruption issue, which has got so much worse during this government, and which has become so blatant, and of course, which is playing an enormously important role in the election campaigns at this point in time.
Is that why Obrador is seen as the front runner?
I think that it's partly because of corruption. He is the candidate who has come out most strongly against corruption, and he's defined it quite broadly by talking about what he calls the mafia of power in Mexico, and saying that basically they've been ripping off the country for decades. But it's also a desencanto, a disenchantment with the established political parties and established politicians. And although Andrés Manuel is perhaps the most established of all the politicians, he's been around the longest, he has managed to brand himself as being somebody who offers real change.
He's been around a long time, as you point out. He's a former mayor of Mexico City. He's a known quantity. To what extent does AMLO, as he's called, represent or actually, represent real change?
What he's proposing is not really change in terms of moving Mexico forward. What he's proposing is really a return to old policies. It seems to be a step back in time, really to the glory days, or the perceived glory days, of the 1970s and 1980s, before the liberalization of the Mexican economy, before Mexico was really open to the world, and before inequality in Mexico reached the terrible levels that it's reached today. But in many ways, of course, that is a false memory. Mexico always had deep, deep poverty issues. Mexico was a backward economy in the 1970s and 1980s. It was an economy which was based upon raw materials, in particular petroleum.
I know he comes from the left, but that kind of nationalist rhetoric sounds almost Trumpian.
It's hearkening back to perceived or really imagined glory days from the 70s and 80s, when there was more control over the national economy. I think that you can see that common thread throughout the Trump administration and what is expected of an Andrés Manuel López Obrador administration here in Mexico, is that there is a return to nationalism. There's a return to the control by the state of economic policy and of the national economy. And so, I mean, there are some really interesting comparisons to be made there, but I don't think we should exaggerate that too much, for the simple reason that Donald Trump is in many ways the anti-politician, and Andrés Manuel is the archetypal politician. I mean, he is really the classic Mexican politician, what people in Mexico call a dinosaur, meaning that they were a member of the ruling party for many years, and they believe in politics being done the old way through backroom deals and bribes. Andrés Manuel really has that pedigree within him. He had his political education within the ruling pre-party, and he left it because he was unsuccessful in an election. He then went over to the left. He left that party when he was unsuccessful with them. He's finally set up his own party. And in the eyes of many political analysts here in Mexico, there is an expectation that what he's trying to do with his party, the Morena party, is he's actually trying to recreate the PRI as it was in the old days.
Of course, that raises questions about NAFTA, but also it brings to mind a piece you wrote not long ago that was where the headline suggested that this may be, in fact, the election in Mexico may be the more important election to Americans in 2018 than even the midterms. What are you driving at?
Well, what we see in terms of U.S.-Mexico cooperation on drugs, on security, on trade and investment has become fundamentally important to the prosperity of Americans and to the security of Americans. And the current administration of Enrique Peña Nieto has been extraordinarily cooperative with the United States. What's interesting is that when they first came into power in 2012, they were highly suspicious of the existing levels of cooperation, and they froze that cooperation for a while. But once they overcame that initial suspicion, they've actually become even more collaborative with the United States than the previous administration. And I think what we're looking at right now is that if you do get a government led by Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who perceives that the relationship with the United States is not a productive one, who sees intense antagonism from the U.S. side of the border, who hears ongoing rhetoric about Mexicans stealing jobs, flooding over the border and being murderers and rapists, then clearly he's not going to be too enthusiastic about continuing that cooperation with the United States.
Put Canada in that picture now. What does that mean for the relationship with Canada?
We don't really know how Andrés Manuel López Obrador feels about Canada. He certainly doesn't have any natural antipathy to Canada. And I think that he would be delighted to appear on a stage with a telegenic prime minister such as Justin Trudeau, despite recent challenges in that image. I think he would seize the opportunity to come to some kind of bilateral agreement on multiple issues with Canada in the event that cooperation with the United States failed to materialize.
From the way you speak, it sounds that if the NAFTA renegotiation doesn't happen before July, that it's likely not to happen given if Obrador wins that election.
He's made a number of statements recently in which he says that NAFTA is incredibly important to Mexico, that ties to the United States are extraordinarily important to Mexico. He is basically giving the impression that he believes that bilateral cooperation with the United States is very, very important as long as it's under the right circumstances. And that's what I'm trying to drive at here. If NAFTA is not completed, if the renegotiation isn't completed before the election, there is a slim chance that it could be ratified by the Mexican Congress in the period between September and December. The new Congress in Mexico will take its seats in September. The new president will take his place at the beginning of December. So there's a period there where you could actually get a ratification of a new NAFTA deal. But let's suppose that they follow Andrés Manuel López Obrador's advice, which is he said, let's freeze the negotiations until the election is in place, until we have a new president in place, so that this is a totally legitimate negotiation. And he's recently proposed his own chief negotiator for NAFTA, whilst at the same time recognizing the great contributions of the existing team and saying that he wants to keep them on because these are very talented negotiators. So he's playing a very interesting game here. He's both talking about change, he's talking about challenging the United States, but he's also talking about continuity so he doesn't really freak out investors and frighten them away from Mexico.
It's going to be a very interesting few months. Thank you very much for your expertise on this.
Great pleasure.